Speaking on tonight's panel, in order of their speaking, I guess their speaking appearances would be Tom Cairns to my left, Cabot Martin to my immediate right, Hubert Kitchen, who is very kindly standing in for Ian Strachan, who is in Nain still, and Ken Mackay from PEI. Tom Cairns will be our first speaker. I'm incidentally Susan Shirk, and I'm with the Extension Service.
In considering the long-term energy needs of the province, an important decision in principle was made at the recent federal-provincial conference in Ottawa. Joint federal-provincial ownership sharing of a large part of Labrador's energy resources through a proposed Lower Churchill Development Corporation was announced in February. This joint ownership is to be the principal basis for the financial and organizational structure of the proposed corporation. Details have not as yet been spelled out publicly, other than that the federal interest will be a minority one, as said. Clearly, the scope of the proposed corporation in terms of both dollars and affected territory will reach and touch every citizen in Newfoundland and Labrador. Clearly, in such an important matter, and because of the bitter experience of Churchill Falls, the new corporation will be so vital that the agreement upon which its structure will be based should never be approved in the name of this province except by a general referendum of the whole voting population. And that's the point I want to make. This means the submission of the proposed agreement after it has been prepared by both governments to the direct vote of the people of Newfoundland and Labrador for approval. This should take place only after full discussion and disclosure of the long-term meaning and content of the agreement. Why the need for ownership sharing of a provincial resource? Why not base the agreement on a loan rather than an ownership arrangement? There can be no question of the need for a public corporation approach to the management structure. This is essential to allow the complex long-term planning associated with such large undertakings to take place. Domination of Newfoundland's resource ventures by the four-year political election cycle with which we have been plagued in the past has clearly been shown to be impractical. However, there also can be no question of the urgent need, based on experience, for the use of the strongest possible magnifying glass in the careful reading and rereading of any agreement in which the powerful influence of Quebec will have any part whatever. As far as this province is concerned, at this time, the Quebec government has expressly and openly declared its intention to ultimately acquire political control of Labrador, in addition to its current economic domination of the use of Labrador's resources. Furthermore, Quebec has shown no neighborly consideration whatever towards this province, while it profiteers unconscionably with resources it was able to acquire as a result of the unfortunate timing of the Churchill Falls Agreement. There are a number of regional development models which can be examined to provide clues as to how this federally sponsored provincial development can take place in the interest of this province and without direct or indirect management domination by Ottawa, and through Ottawa, further indirect domination by Quebec. For example, there's the TVA system, which has proved to be so successful in the United States. There's Quebec's own provincially sponsored James Bay Development Corporation. There was the Depression days Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, which meant so much to the prairie provinces in their time of need. It will take time to look at all these models and design one which is acceptable to the people of this province. However, let us not be misled, either intentionally or unintentionally. Newfoundlanders should be suspicious. We should be very suspicious. We should be prepared, indeed, if the deal is not acceptable, to say no and mean it. Whatever short-term consequences we may have to face can never be as severe as the future loss of the vital heritages of this province. The only way to be sure that the scrutiny needed for the far-reaching agreement involving the proposed Lower Churchill Development Corporation, and particularly under the present possibility of the domination of Ottawa's interests by Quebec interests, is to give the draft agreement to the general voting public of Newfoundland and Labrador for final approval.
Dr. Kitchen?
Thank you very much, and let me congratulate the Extension Service on this series of seminars, which I believe is devoted to some of the more pressing problems in the province. We have devised, in part of a policy at least, with respect to hydroelectrical energy. And we have introduced this policy as a resolution before the House of Assembly. We have been debating it now on Private Members' Day for 3 weeks, and we'll be debating it perhaps for some further time. And it's interesting to note that this resolution is getting support from both sides of the House, and the discussion is, I believe, largely non-partisan and an attempt to discuss some of the real issues with respect to the development of hydroelectricity in the province and the purposes for which it's to be developed. I want to read this resolution and comment on it. I'll leave out the whereases and all that stuff. Be it resolved that the House urge the provincial government to commence immediate negotiations with the federal government designed to bring about the bold, creative economic strategy of developing and processing within Labrador its natural resources and raw materials. This strategy to include A, developing Labrador's hydro resources primarily as a source of power for the industrial development of the province, particularly Labrador, and for the province's domestic and commercial use, with any surplus power being made available to other provinces of Canada on a short-term, recallable basis only, developing a fully serviced, fully fledged Port Labrador on the Labrador coast, and constructing a railway and a road from Port Labrador to Happy Valley Goose Bay, onto Labrador City Wabush, and on to central Canada, processing within Labrador of Labrador raw materials, including minerals, fish, forests, and offshore oil and gas as discovered in commercial quantities. And fourth, assurances that these developments will proceed only after full consideration of methods to protect the environment and after full consultation with the peoples living in all parts of Labrador. And just on a few words on this resolution, basically I suppose we have to consider why we want hydroelectricity. And basically there seems to me to be about 3 reasons. We need something to keep us warm. We need something to cook a bit of grub and to run a few luxury appliances. But perhaps mainly we need it as a source of energy to provide industry and jobs, to keep employed the 70 or 80,000 people we have presently unemployed, and the hundreds of thousands of others who will be coming afterwards. In this connection, I think we should realize that we have an immense treasure house of hydroelectricity in Labrador, twice the power of James Bay, almost about more than 10 times the power of Niagara. This is the sort of hydroelectricity we're talking about. We have all of the developed hydroelectricity, as everybody knows here, is, with the exception of a few megawatts, is being exported out of the province. We also have in Labrador large mining deposits which are presently exported in virtually a raw form to provide hundreds of thousands of jobs in parts of the United States, in the steel industry and secondary industry there. The only way we could think of developing Labrador wood was to bring it into Stephenville or to export it to Europe. We're not developing any processing of wood in Labrador. We've never developed the processing of fish much in Labrador, and historically we've just taken it down here. So this colonization of Labrador by the island, and more latterly by Canada, mainland of Canada, and by the United States, is a policy which has just got to stop. There are 2 or 3 problems, as I see it, with respect to it. The financial development of processing industries, whether it be iron ore or pulp and paper or whatever, is going to cost a lot of money. Raising the money for it is problematical. One suggestion has been made that we work together with the federal government in this, and that the federal government help out in having money raised in some sort of a joint corporation. Another way might be to use oil revenues, which are going to be short-lived, I think, anyway, assuming we find oil in commercial quantities, Perhaps in 20 years there will be no oil left, but it will be great if we can use the revenues generated from oil to develop the other parts of Labrador rather than to just blow it on a great big binge. And also, of course, the other possibility is that we might be able to levy a resource tax or something like that on the Upper Churchill power and use the revenues from that, the massive revenues so generated to create the type of industrial development that we need to employ our people and to employ those resources, the minerals, the fishery, the forestry, with hydroelectricity as the long-term energy source.
Cabot Martin, to my right, is the legal advisor for the Minister of Mines and Energy.
Given the state of employment and economic situation in Newfoundland, obviously we would prefer to have an early development of offshore oil and gas. On the other hand, the kinds of traditional stimulus that governments have offered oil companies to come and develop resources such as tax breaks, easy terms, and this sort of thing, have in many countries led to the thing we didn't want, which was an overheated economy and a boom and bust situation. So these were typically two of the conflicting objectives or policy aspects that we found ourselves with. But anyway, we did go through a process and we developed some policy objectives and we embodied them in regulations and in draft regulations, and we negotiated with the companies. I think we must remember that apart from the Upper Churchill, maybe the Romaine diversion and Gull, we are dealing with some on a scale attractive resources, but nothing like what we're talking about at the Upper Churchill. The Upper Churchill stands out as being so different in its cost to value ratio that everything else pales into consideration. So in addition to the heating our homes and cooking some grub and providing some jobs list, I think we have to add, perhaps at the top of the list, the economic rent, which is now being collected in various manners by Quebec from the Upper Churchill contract. Now, it is true that we were discussing this afternoon. If we were to collect this economic rent, what would we do with it? How would we apply it? Would we spend it wisely? Would we just spend it on expensive infrastructure, more grand buildings like we're in now? Or would we change the industrial structure of the province? That's for the wisdom of our leaders. But what is very apparent is that if we were, for instance, to have the right of recall, we could not possibly recall 4,800 megawatts of power fast enough to make much difference. 4,800 megawatts of power is something like 16 aluminum smelters. Howard McIntyre down there can correct me. Maybe it's only 12. But in other words, it is a great deal of power which we could not possibly build the industry in the short term to absorb.
Possibly because of the nature of Prince Edward Island. It is a small island. People are stubborn, prefer to do their own thing. The island is rural. It does rely on agriculture and fisheries, and then tourism comes next in terms of generating income. I forgot government. I guess that's number one. So as a result of these things, it was very easy to say no to large development. There's no large energy source there. There appears to be no prospects for large development. The Institute of Mineral Resources, which I'm with, was set up about 3 years ago to explore ways of making Prince Edward Island self-reliant, not only in terms of energy, but also in terms of food production, in terms of agriculture, inputs in agriculture and fisheries and things like that. Last year they were able to negotiate with the federal government substantial funding for an energy program, which I'll go through with you now. And the approach is that of what Amory Lovins calls soft paths, soft technology, something that's not sort of massive and like throwing rocks in front of a river and damming, making a huge lake or something like that, but something that's much easier on the environment if you want, something that people can relate to, people can fix. And that's the approach that we've taken on the island. In terms of the programs, one of the first things was, okay, if you start getting local power sources, what are you going to do with them? Can you, if you've got excess power, dump that out on the grid? The grid's already there, why not use it? So one of the first programs was to analyze the electrical use patterns in Prince Edward Island and not only see where you can conserve, because that's been going on. In fact, yesterday they announced that the per person usage had gone down 17 kilowatt hours. I don't know if that was a month or a year or what. If you're going to put a lot of small-scale systems producing electricity onto the grid, what is that going to do to your electrical utility? So there's a study going on right now trying to determine that sort of thing. Some of you people may know about Gemini inverters and things like that, where you can have a windmill that'll actually put power out and feed it back to the grid, sell it to the utility if they'll let you. In some cases there is approval in some provinces and states, in others there isn't. But that's the sort of thing. If you have 50 windmills suddenly cut in, what happens? Do you blow up the whole system or not? The other area the Institute has been exploring is looking at local renewable sources of energy. And perhaps we're really out to lunch, perhaps we're not. 30 years will probably tell. We are looking at wind energy, at water power, believe it or not. We're looking at hydropower, not the megawatts that we were talking about before. We might be looking at something as big as 50 kilowatts. We are looking at heads of 10, 15, 20 feet that may supply power for a family or for a small woolen mill or something like that. In terms of solar energy, the first thing we identified as the most immediate area where solar energy could be a benefit was that in terms of water heating. And so starting last summer, the Institute purchased about 6 or 7 off-the-shelf commercial water heaters. The eventual intent is to have about 30 of these installed on commercial homes and monitoring them. What we found so far is that don't do it. The off-the-shelf items are expensive. A lot of the people manufacturing them don't know what they're doing yet. The guys who install them are often even worse. And basically, off-the-shelf solar systems are too expensive. Mainly because people have not really sat down and analyzed what should a solar system be. How do you cut the costs of that? It may surprise you that probably the most available alternative in Prince Edward Island right now is wood. I didn't believe it, but half the island is covered in wood. Unfortunately, that's not in one big block. A contractor can't go in and cut it because it's at the end of each farm. So that's a very dispersed resource. And it's a resource which can be used in the rural area and is traditionally used in the rural area and is still used by many of the same people who just were so far behind they're ahead. Thing that the Institute is now involved in, which they've been peripherally involved in before, is the ARC on Prince Edward Island, which, as I said before, was set up by the New Alchemy Institute and is now about to become a project of the Institute of Mountain Resources. I'll show you a few slides, but just before that, the ARC was set up to integrate a living system with a food production system based on renewable energy. Now, don't believe anything you've read about the ARC. There's a Harold Smith article outside, which is not bad, but I think they say that they're producing all sorts of power and selling it back to the grid. There's been a lot of extravagant claims. The Ark is not self-sufficient. We have to go back to Ottawa for some more money to keep it going. But we're exploring ways in becoming self-sufficient. There's a greenhouse and an aquaculture system. There's windmill. The system is solar heated, and I think the greatest contribution of the Ark right now is that it's shown that a totally solar heated greenhouse will produce food all winter. I had some salad last night from it. Doesn't freeze. And what we have to do now is look at the economics of that, and also look at the whether that can be improved on, expanded. And I think that has relevance to Newfoundland, certainly in food production. If you look at energy use in the food system, 80% of it is used not on the farm, but in transportation, processing, and even in home preparation.
Dr. Evans.
Dr. Mackay came up with the tantalizing idea that energy does not develop jobs. I wonder if you would expand on that idea. That seems to be completely contrary to what everybody else thinks.
I know I should have mentioned that. I think the best thing is if you get the Barrie Commoner's paper from Jeff Stiles, who copied it when he was over visiting us, that'll explain it much better than I could. But I guess the concept goes something like this, is that really what jobs and things are about in the past have been using human energy. What energy sources, which in the last 30 years have been very cheap energy sources, have done is replace some sort of mechanical system for human energy. And by the very nature of that, they've had to displace jobs. And in many cases, it's been necessary. I mean, we talk of labor-saving devices, and that's really what they were. But it seems that we're at some sort of crux now, that we're running out of energy and we haven't got any jobs. And I think we have to really look very, very hard at what the alternatives are. And it may mean a total change in the way society looks at things.
It's a question of what one would do if one had all Labrador power, all the Upper Churchill power. I think it would be absolute folly to have ever thought of transmitting it to the island. What one would do, I think, would be to have a very capital-intensive operation there. For example, and the thing we've personally been working on, is something that would make it possible to convert the iron ore, which is after all perhaps the largest resource we have, using electricity, to something that we can sell. We thought about this in connection with the political aspirations and the job creation, and I personally think the only way is for such an operation to be government run, the profits to be fed into the economy and to create jobs in other ways. In other words, one doesn't create jobs on the spot where the energy is being used, because that is capital intensive and energy intensive, and in fact requires very few personnel to operate. But of course you would have perhaps some secondary industries which would create some jobs, but I think that the main object would be not to allow entrepreneurs to run away with the profits, but to siphon them into government and make use of them in other ways.
Who is going to do it? This is really the essence of the whole, no matter what it is, whether we're going to develop transportation by dog team in that part of the country, you really have to have some method, some structure on which the whole thing is going to be developed. And this is really what I think must come first. We have got to develop the ownership arrangement, and unfortunately we have allowed others to do this kind of thing for us. And this is the reason for my basic suggestion that the people of Newfoundland now consider this themselves. We have allowed people to consider the concept of the railroad from Sept-Îles to Quebec to develop the iron ore, which really we get very little benefit compared to the amount of if you go to Sept-Îles, there's a community there in the neighborhood of, I think it's around 30,000 people now, virtually the size of all the population of all the rest of Labrador together. And that's taking and based on a resource which is in our part of Labrador. Similarly, you can say the same thing about Churchill. And now we're talking about other things in which we're proposing to have the federal government, which, as I try to caution you about, is really dominated, has been dominated since 1867 by two provinces. And we have not developed a structure. We have to be realistic in the sense that somehow or other, having tied ourselves to Canada, we have got to work with Canada, but it's the important thing is what kind of structure is there that we can work on. And I keep coming back to the organization as being the basis on which you will build.
I was just out in Edmonton and talking with some of the people there and the doctors and the social service staff. People have gone back to the land because they've got a very rich renewable resource base there. One community does not. That is the community named Coppermine. The government, in its generosity, decided these people must be trained to work in the oil and gas industry. Gulf Oil took all the able-bodied men of that community to train them to be workers for the proposed pipeline. Likewise, there was a training program sponsored by government called Nortran that took many people who lived on the land and trained them to be gas plant operators. Where are they now? There are 70 unemployed, almost all the men of Coppermine, who no longer know how to hunt and trap and no longer have the supplies. There are quite a few trained people from the North Delta who now have no place to work and no skills. So I'm wondering what we're setting up if we're not looking at the same time. I'm not saying, and neither are the people of the North, no gas and oil. But what do we do at the same time to ensure that we have a resource base that's going to last?
This has been a Memorial University of Newfoundland Extension Service video production.